For decades now, Radiohead have been at the forefront of popular music, from the anxious futurism of OK Computer through the desolate soundscapes of Kid A and more. Tom, Johnny and the rest of the band have forged a reputation as pioneering, exciting musicians who always have something to say. And throughout their entire run, Jonny Greenwood's musical background and interest in contemporary classical music has left marks of 20th century classical all over their work. And of all these 20th century composers, 3 stand head and shoulders above the rest as Radiohead's classical influences. The minimalist soundscapes of Steve Reich, the avant-garde wails of Krzysztof Penderecki, and the liturgical majesty of my favourite composer, Olivier Messiaen. Even if some people find it hard to draw a connection between this and this, Radiohead's guitarist and arranger Jonny Greenwood says that it's all music, and as such, should all be considered in the same way. I found it quite healthy, particularly at school, to think about classical composers and rock bands in the same way. The reason I loved Messiaen, for instance, was that he was still alive and writing. To me, that was as exciting as a great old rock band still being around. When we discuss Messiaen's influence on Radiohead, I view there as being 3 main components of his influence: his harmonic influence, his instrumental influence, and his extra-musical influence. Firstly, let's discuss his harmonic influence, namely the octatonic scale that both Messiaen and Radiohead love so dearly. If you're familiar with Radiohead or Messiaen, this should already conjure up certain melodies in your head. When we talk about the octatonic scale, what we're normally referring to is a scale consisting of alternating tones and semitones. In a 2019 interview with The Guardian, Jonny Greenwood professed his love of the octatonic scale to be so strong that it became the namesake of his classical music label, Octatonic Records. It's no surprise, therefore, that the octatonic scale crops up again and again throughout Radiohead's music. Easily the most famous octatonic example within Radiohead's work is in Just. The opening moments would not be described as octatonic. However, hints at the octatonic moments to come are evident in the opening acoustic guitar chords. The opening C major chord points firmly away from any octatonic tonality, pulling us firmly towards a tonal centre of C major. Whilst the next chords are also not octatonic, the pure C major is shattered, with chords of E flat major and D major appearing next. David Bennett's analysis of Just describes this chord progression in terms of modal interchange, citing the E flat major as modal interchange of the parallel minor, and the D major chord from C Lydian. And whilst this is one way of looking at it, another way of looking at it is the roots of the chord progression here outline an ascending octatonic scale in thirds, subtly introducing an octatonic feel before the introduction of Jonny Greenwood's guitar. This next moment is unquestionably the most famous octatonic moment throughout Radiohead's whole career, the rapid, ascending tremolo guitar line in octaves, frantically attacked by Jonny Greenwood. This is pure octatonic. In fact, if you hear an octatonic scale on its own, I bet this song comes to mind. This octatonic riff repeats throughout the song, and is definitely the best and most famous example of octatonic use in Radiohead's work. However, Just is hardly the only example of octatonic uses by Radiohead. There are plenty, but here's just one more. The eerie, otherworldly sound created in These Are My Twisted Words is also partially down to the octatonic scale. Though it has a distinctly different feel to that in Just. This is because it's the other type of octatonic scale, a half-whole diminished scale rather than a whole half one. They're the same scale, except starting on different notes. Here's the one used in Just compared to the one used in These Are My Twisted Words. The reason these two types of octatonic scale can both exist and be called octatonic is because they are modes of limited transposition. In a minute, I'll explore how this is symptomatic of Messiaen's influence in Radiohead, but first I'll explain what modes of limited transposition are. If you take a basic major scale, if you start on any of the 7 degrees of the scale, you will get a completely unique mode. However, if you take an octatonic scale, After you've shifted the starting note 2 times, you get the same scale as the first, only starting on a different note. This makes it a mode of limited transposition. And this is where Messiaen's influence becomes stark. Messiaen's modes of limited transposition form a lot of the harmonic basis of his work. They're 7 symmetrical scales which Messiaen outlines in his book The Technique of My Musical Language, which outlines each of the modes, chords voiced within them, and several examples of them. The second mode is the octatonic scale, which has such frequent use in Radiohead's work, and it can be seen, for example, in this moment in Les Sons Impalpables du Rêve. But, of course, you cannot talk about the work of Olivier Messiaen without talking about synesthesia. Colours are very important to me, because I have a gift. Whenever I hear music, or even if I read music, I see colours. Synesthesia has been important throughout the work of Messiaen. His first acknowledgement of the influence of colour came in his book The Technique of My Musical Language in 1944. In this, he describes the harmony of the Quartet for the End of Time's second movement as blue-orange. He later would outline exactly what this synesthesia consisted of. He described how each pitch, each note, has a unique colour, and even a slight shift of a semitone could change it completely. These colours repeat at the octave, becoming more diluted with whites in higher octaves, and more diluted with blacks in lower octaves. He goes into even further detail, describing how he hears colours in the harmonic series. For example, Messiaen describes how a fifth above yellow is violet, and a fifth above blue is orange. I could go into lots of detail of Messiaen's synesthesia. One example comes in his 8th piano prelude, which he described as orange, veined with violet, supposing the violet are the chromatic interjections in the orange of the pure E major. But there's not a huge amount of point in me delving into the countless examples of the well-trodden ground of Messiaen's synesthesia. I'll link a brilliant video by listening in that expands on this in the description. The point I'm trying to convey is that, for Messiaen, colour and visuals are of utmost importance. Though he's never fully come out and said it, it's not unreasonable to think that Thom Yorke may be synesthetic, at least to a degree. In 1997, during a conversation about synesthesia with MTV Japan, Thom Yorke had this to say about OK Computer.
It was like mucky white, like the sort of white you get when you try and typect something out on a page.
Oh, wow.
That sort of white.
In his subsequent comment, Radiohead's bassist Colin Greenwood outlines the connection between visuals and sounds that is so prevalent in Messiaen's work too.
A lot of that stuff is, all that kind of images is in the artwork that you were working on.
Yeah.
I mean, the artwork on this record, I think, is fantastic. I mean, it's a pity we don't have anything to show you now.
And this is where we come to Radiohead's artist, Stanley Donwood.
When I've been working painting with Radiohead playing music, I find their music very visual to me. It looks like something.
Unusually for a band, Donwood is often in the studio with Radiohead, developing his artwork alongside the music rather than afterwards, allowing the artwork to grow organically like the music. I think perhaps no work of Radiohead is more visually and musically intertwined than Kid A. The cold, jagged synthesizers of the opening of Everything in Its Right Place is reflective of the cold colours and jagged shapes of the cover artwork. Yorke said of the Kid A artwork that because it was in the Radiohead studio, they were able to work on the artwork in the way the band were working on the music. I know I'm not forming direct links between Messiaen and Radiohead here, but this more abstract concept of the importance of visuals and music is still very important, especially when we know that Johnny Greenwood is such a fan of Messiaen. However, a far more direct influence that Messiaen has had on Radiohead is their prominent use of the OndeMartino. Maurice Martineau, a French cellist, had a role as a radio operator during the First World War, and his taste for the pure sound of the radio waves, or sine waves, would lead him to develop an instrument that could replicate these and other sounds in 1928, named the OndeMartino. It's a keyboard instrument, where the right hand controls the pitch, and the left hand controls the timbre. The sound is rather similar to the more famous theremin. Though is much easier to control, leading Greenwood to liken it to the human voice.
Why do you love OndeMartino?
Why? Because, I think partly it's because I can't sing. And I've always wanted to be able to play an instrument that was like singing.
The most famous use of the OndeMartino in Messiaen's work, and by extension all of classical music, is in his Tarangulila Symphony. Vibrant, expressive glissandos in the opening moments of the Tarantella firmly establish the OndeMartino as a central piece of this huge work. And it remains important throughout the whole piece. One example where it takes prominence is in the Tarantelli's sixth movement, Garden of Love's Sleep, where it joins forces with the strings to play the slow and wistful love theme. It's fair to say that, in the 20th century, Messiaen made the OndeMartino. Though Messiaen embraced the instrument, its inventor Maurice Martineau was less enthusiastic about the idea of having it mass-produced, and therefore the popularity of the OndeMartino began to wane in the latter half of the 20th century, before eventually slipping into obscurity. That is, until Kid A. It was the influence of Messiaen, and specifically his Tarantella Symphony, something which Johnny would describe himself as round-the-bend obsessed with, that led him to learn and incorporate the OndeMartino into much of Radiohead's music. The first appearance in Radiohead's discography of the OndeMartino comes in the title track of Kid A, but rather than it being used to produce its typical sound, Tom York's voice was electronically superimposed over the pitches of the OndeMartino, creating a weird, glitched vocal effect. It would appear on the next two songs as well, albeit in its more traditional form, here in the national anthem. Here in How to Disappear Completely. Use of the OndeMartino beyond the realm of his work with Radiohead, such as his 2004 piece Smear, in which the opening takes full advantage of the OndeMartino's microtonal capabilities, with two OndeMartinos rubbing highly distantly against one another, creating an eerie and unsettling beating between the two instruments. Hopefully this has demonstrated the fingerprints of Messiaen that are left all across Radiohead's work, showcasing Radiohead's strength of making music that is sophisticated and refined, whilst remaining listenable and accessible, whilst Messiaen's innovation and exploration of sound and harmony has led to some of the most forward-thinking and unique music of the 20th century. And if you're more familiar with either Radiohead or Messiaen, I hope this inspires you to investigate the other a little more, for it's like Johnny Greenwood said, it is all, at the end of the day, just music.